We now return to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute, the radio show discussing the honest truth about Illinois policy and politics. Here's AM 560's Dan Proft.
Dan Proft back with Pat Hughes on this edition of Illinois Rising. And Pat, I have been outed, and I want to kind of own up to it. I've been outed by, this past week by both Eric Zorn, the Hugo Chavezian op-ed writer for the Tribune, as well as Michael Miner in the Chicago Reader. I'm the first newspaper publisher in apparently modern times who has a point of view. And that is a problem, such a problem that I'm a brazen propagandist engaged in mock journalism, according to Eric Zorn. I'm also something of a political operative, though Mr. Miner over at the Reader imagines I'd prefer a loftier description. Miner is, for those of you who don't know, don't read the Chicago Reader, never heard of it, don't care, no reason to. But just by way of background, Miner is like the Ellsworth Toohey of the Chicago Press Corps. So he is essentially a media critic, an arbiter of what is right and proper and what disgraces the hallowed profession of the media. And so I'll invoke Howard Rourke, since I'm making a Fountainhead reference, and respond to Mr. Miner that what do I think of what he thinks of me? I don't think of what he thinks of me. So I'm actually not interested in what his description is, but I am interested in the argument that he makes, because it's very much, it's in part what Zorn said as well. Essentially, if you don't do the inverse pyramid the way that we've done journalism for a half a century at least in this city and in this kind of establishment model, then you're engaged in mock journalism, or, as the phrase goes in these times, fake news.
Yeah, this is how it started when print was starting to cede ground to the internet 10, 12, 15 years ago, and it's no different now. There are two things, Dan, going on here. First is the sort of the temerity you would have to start newspapers and not go through, like you mentioned, the austere process of going to Northwestern Journalism School and then being a beat writer and then this, that, and the other thing. And now, look, I'm a columnist for the Chicago Tribune or for the Chicago Reader. So there's that sort of like arrogance going on. But the bigger point is the competition, and not competition in terms of money and dollars, because newspapers are failing, other than yours, of course. It's the competition for the ideas, right? These publications, I mean, look at the irony. Eric Zorn is commenting on your newspaper from a newspaper, right? And he's making political commentary. And the fact that there's other opinion leaders out there that can get out to readers in a way that's more efficient, in a way that they're interested in consuming the news, is a threat not just to their model economically, but to the threat of the monopoly they feel they have on thought. And from Zorn's perspective, and I suspect Miner's perspective, from left-leaning liberal orthodoxy.
Yeah, they're being marginalized. They're losing. And so for the cover story for losing, and by the way, that's not my mentality, that's their mentality. Because I'm transparent about my point of view, and that certainly informs the stories that we select to cover and the way we cover them. And that's the case for everybody in journalism. I hate to break it to those who think there's this superhuman race of journalists who have no point of view. Every human being has a point of view, and it influences how they do their jobs. So if we could just start from that agreed upon point, then maybe we could get somewhere. But they have an agenda. Michael Miner has been voting socialist in Chicago since the 1980s, just as Eric Zorn has. Probably go back a decade for Zorn. So that's fine, but don't pretend you don't have a point of view. Of course you have a point of view. And they have an agenda, a policy agenda, and they have political candidates they want to see elected, basically the ones that have been elected in Chicago for 100 years. And so to cover their losing from their perspective, they do a few things. One, they cherry pick stories, right? So in his piece, which is humorously entitled, "If Your Community News is Slanted, Dan Proft may be to blame," because we are having an impact. And we do have 20 papers that cover every region of the state, and we're going to add more titles as we go and as we're successful and able to do so. So community news is slanted. It wasn't slanted until I got here a year ago with these papers. Before, it was the model of objectivity, the fantasy world that Michael Miner and Eric Zorn believe they live in. But they cherry pick a little radio bit that me and my co-host Amy Jacobson did on Chicago's Morning Answer about Hillary emails, where I have a little fun with Hillary after this alleged WikiLeaked email of John Podesta accusing Hillary of emanating malodorous fumes and so forth. We do a little radio bit. So now I'm not a serious person because I did a radio bit on a morning drive show. And then they cherry pick a story where one of my publications, 19 statewide, thousands upon thousands of stories in under a year. One story is about me as in my role as the head of a super PAC in Illinois, essentially issuing a point of view on the grand bargain in the General Assembly and suggesting that Republican senators who voted for that permanent tax increase in exchange for fleeting non-reforms would be putting their seats in jeopardy. Well, as a super PAC that raised and spent $10 million last year, and not to be immodest, but I'm an influencer. And so to cover me, by the way, it wasn't only covered by our paper, the Sangamon Sun, Sangamon County, it was also covered by Capital Facts, Rich Miller, and other outlets. So I'm an influencer in that space, and so we covered it in that outlet. But that means this is just a vanity play by me, according to Mike Miner. So it's the same kind of stuff, and then they dig up, controversy, alleged controversy regarding my partner in this enterprise, Brian Timpone, who, of course, you know, Pat, and his time producing local news content for the Chicago Tribune, which was the only time local news content for the Chicago Tribune was actually a profitable enterprise. When Timpone and his company went away, so did Trib Local go away. So we're doing all these stories that are newsifying data, publicly available data on pensions and salaries and property taxes and effective property tax rates and home values. We're doing stories that are local about school referenda and local races. And here's what Zorn and Miner are left to cherry pick a few things, to caricature me, to caricature my partner in this enterprise, to try and hold on to their little perch for one day longer.
This is the same sentiment that has people the day after Trump is inaugurated saying, what are we going to do to impeach him? He needs to go. It's the same thing, right? They feel their grip loosening. They feel that if you give readers an option and they don't have to consume the same old thing that Zorn and Miner have been peddling for couple of decades, that their influence will wane because they're not offering what the readers want, and they're not giving news or opinion in the way that readers want, which is why their business is dwindling and yours is growing. And with every movement that starts to die, Dan, you hear squeals and cries and stomping of the feet. And because these guys are essentially children, this is what they're going to do.
Right. And so there's a funny piece in this, too, about you, so to speak, where he suggests that Illinois Rising, I co-host with Michael Lucci, the vice president of policy at the Illinois Policy Institute. So it tells you. So you see what Miner did. He picks one story. He finds the one story that he cares about in the thousands that all my papers have done. He finds one bit from the thousands of hours of morning drive radio I've done. And he listens to one episode of Illinois Rising where Michael Lucci is the co-host and not you, who's co-hosted it more than anybody. And he says, that's my co-host because he's doesn't care.
He doesn't care.
And so he said of me on this little radio bit I did, perhaps Proft was too obtuse to suspect anything. Perhaps he didn't care. Well, I suppose he's living in a glass house on the same matter. Perhaps Miner was too obtuse to suspect anything. Perhaps he didn't care with respect to understanding actually how Illinois Rising works. He reminds me of Ben Affleck preparing for a role as memorialized by Family Guy. Ben Affleck sitting watching TV. He's like, oh my gosh, I got to be Henry VIII in 15 minutes. Hello, nailed it. And then he runs out of the scene. That's Michael Miner's journalism that we're supposed to all genuflect before.